Hi, everybody. We are going to continue with our central nervous system part 2. Please do note that the new PowerPoint has been uploaded to better serve us for the online teaching. So make sure you guys go to your Canvas page and download the new file. So reviewing some of the last concept we discussed on the previous PowerPoint, one of the last things we talked about was the cerebral cortex and the fact that it does contain multiple sections. One area was associated with your sensory area, which was basically collecting data from your typical senses, like your sense of smell, taste, auditory, vision, etc. You have motor area, which controls only and only your voluntary movement, which means it is specific to skeletal muscle. And we have association area, which is important in terms of integration of diverse information. And we'll talk about these in a little more detail as we go through the PowerPoint. Do understand that the brain works on the concept of contralateral as the opposite side controlled by the opposite side of the brain. So if you have a stroke on the right cerebral cortex, the left side of the body is paralyzed as a result. We also have a new concept that I didn't discuss with you guys last time, referred to as lateralization. Lateralization implies that each hemisphere is specialized in certain tasks, and it becomes again clear as we go through the PowerPoint what that means. Last is conscious behavior involves entire cortex in one way or another. So to kind of highlight this, I added a new picture for you guys, which basically shows anything in terms of activity of the brain, anything that is the dark kind of blacked out area, that means there's no activity, versus if you have any color, whether it be yellow, green, orange, or red, that means you have more activity. The darker the color in terms of yellow or orange or red, the more activity you have. So to kind of figure this out, if you look at your first one that is basically showing you your sense of vision, it's kind of showing you it is localized in the occipital lobe of the brain, so you have the highest activity. However, do note that the rest of the brain still shows levels of activity in terms of having that color green and yellow on it. Hearing, on the other hand, is more centralized in the temporal lobe. Speaking is more frontal lobe. And when you are thinking, actively thinking, most of your brain is involved. So don't assume just as I go through this, just because I'm talking about one part of the brain, the rest of the brain will be dormant. So continuing with our information, one of the first senses that we're going to talk about is a sense called somatosensory. That's basically your sense of touch. Now, as you go through the PowerPoint again, you notice that we have two aspects of your typical senses. Part of the brain that is going to receive the data, and the other part is making sense of what that data means. So basically integration. So let's go ahead and go through the first senses, which is again somatosensory, or sense of touch. So first of all, in terms of location, it's located in the postcentral gyrus, which is part of the parietal lobe. So if you go to the slide, a couple of slides forward, you can see your central sulcus, which is separating your frontal lobe from your parietal lobe. And the area immediately after your central sulcus, which we identified as a postcentral gyrus, is dedicated to your somatosensory cortex, for primary somatosensory cortex. It is important, again, in terms of receiving general sensory data from your skin, your skeletal muscle, joints, and tendons. So this is the only part that is receiving the data. Now, notice the second part of this slide, somatosensory homunculus. This is something we discussed last time as well. Basically, the areas which have higher number of neurons will have the larger part of these postcentral gyrus dedicated to receiving those signals. The smaller or the lower the number of your neurons, the less part of your postcentral gyrus is dedicated to receiving this data. So if you look at the picture that I have posted for somatosensory cortex, this is again your postcentral gyrus. You notice the areas that have a lot of neurons or a lot of receptors are your hands, your feet, your face, and basically your tongue and your gum. So even though overall they are relatively a small surface area of your body, because they have so many neurons collecting data, because of their sensitivity, a larger part of your somatosensory cortex is dedicated to receiving that information. Now, up to this point, all I have done in the postcentral gyrus is to receive data. But what is the next step that I need to do? Is I need to make sense of what I have received. So for that, we refer to a part of the brain that sits posterior to your primary somatosensory cortex called somatosensory association cortex. So as the name implies, the word association in this case implies that you are trying to figure out what the sense of touch actually means. You're trying to make sense of what you're actually touching. So the first step, if I'm sensing that I'm touching something, just feeling that I'm touching a surface, for instance, that's my primary somatosensory cortex. But if I'm trying to say, oh, okay, the surface is cold, the surface is hot, the surface is rough versus smooth, for me to distinguish those, that is associated with our somatosensory association area. As I'm using my previous knowledge, what I have from my previous experiences to figure out the surface is smooth, the surface is hot, the surface is cold. So make sure that you can distinguish between the concept of primary somatosensory cortex versus somatosensory association area. Your other strong senses is your sense of vision, your ability to see. Again, same concept applies to your sense of vision. The occipital lobe, or the most posterior aspect of the occipital lobe, which is right here, is identified as primary visual cortex, as this part of your brain is going to receive data from your retinas, which is part of your eye, and basically give you your sense of vision. Now, up to this point, you haven't really distinguished what you're looking at. So visual association area, which is the area right immediately in front of that. Again, the word association implies now you're trying to make sense of what you're seeing. So visual association area, again, is going to use your previous experiences in life to figure out what you're seeing is, let's say, is a cup versus your phone versus a friend versus your neighbor. You can distinguish faces, you can distinguish objects, color, etc. So it is a very complex process. It is involving a good chunk of your occipital lobe in terms of processing what you're actually seeing and making sense of that data. So please pay attention to this again. Distinguishing primary visual versus visual association area. So if you have damage to your primary visual cortex, which means the most posterior aspect of your occipital lobe, that is causes functional blindness, as an eye will not be able to see anything. However, if the damage is not to the primary visual cortex, rather it is to the visual association area, I can see, but I might not be able to comprehend what I'm looking at. So there's a distinguish between me not being able to see anything at all versus I see something, but I cannot tell you what I'm seeing. I do not have the comprehension or the previous experiences and memories that tell me what I can see. Auditory area, very similar to what we discussed in terms of vision and somatosensory. Part of your temporal lobe is dedicated to receiving data from your ear. That's referred to as the primary auditory cortex. Again, collecting data from your ear is primary auditory cortex. However, making sense of, oh, I'm hearing my phone ringing versus music playing versus TV is talking, making that distinction, making differences between sounds that I'm hearing, that would be my what? Auditory association area. So make that distinction. Where are they located? Right here on the temporal lobe is your primary auditory cortex, and right behind that would be your primary auditory association area or auditory association area. Your sense of a smell does not have that distinction as we described so far. So you do have your sense of olfactory or sense of a smell is located on the temporal lobe, more the medial aspect of it, as you can kind of see where the arrow is pointing to. It is a primitive part of your rhombencephalon, which alongside your olfactory bulb and tract, which basically collect data from your nose. And all you need to know for this is giving you your sense or conscious awareness of odors. Again, distinguishing between you're smelling a cookie versus trash versus a rose, etc. Vestibular cortex. The word might be new to you guys, so let's just go over that. Vestibular imply your sense of balance or conscious awareness of balance. It also can tell you where your head is located in terms of a space. Vestibular, the word vestibular comes from a part of your ear which is responsible for your sense of balance and positioning of the head called vestibule. And you'll learn about this in a special sense lecture next time. But what we need to understand is your conscious awareness of where your head is in relation to the space is processed by the deep lobe that is underneath the temporal lobe. We learned a name called insula, and that's basically the part that's giving you a conscious awareness of the positioning of your head. Again, that's called vestibular cortex. Gustatory cortex is associated with your sense of taste. So again, this is also located in the insula. You don't really need to be able to distinguish specifically what part of insula is responsible for that, as far as you understand that insula is involved in your sense of taste. Last sense, which is again not one of your common 5 senses, called visceral sensory. This is posterior to your gustatory cortex. It is still belong to your insula, and basically gives you a conscious perception of your visceral sensation. Again, we discussed this last time. Visceral implies that these are internal senses, such as your stomach, stomachache, or bladder being full. So when I ask you guys questions in your exam, please make sure you guys can point out what each of these structures are located in terms of a picture. So if I point out, for instance, to this region of the brain, what I see in blue, if I ask you what is the name of this section, you should be able to say that is the postcentral gyrus. If I ask you guys what lobe is it associated with, you should be able to say that is parietal lobe. If I ask you what is the function of your postcentral gyrus, or if I just point out to that section, you should be able to tell me that is your primary somatosensory cortex, which basically receives data from your sense of touch. Now, moving up to this point, as you guys noticed, we have talked about the temporal lobe, we have talked about the parietal, the occipital, and insula, but I haven't really mentioned the frontal lobe. So frontal lobe is actually involved in our motor control. And more specifically, again, the keyword here is voluntary movement, which means we're talking about a skeletal muscle movement, not cardiac or smooth muscle, specifically a skeletal muscle. Now, there are specific regions within that brain. Some of them are kind of self-explanatory. So primary motor cortex, premotor cortex, Broca's area, and frontal eye field. So let's find these on a picture and then again associate a function to each one. Primary or somatic motor cortex is what you see right here. So this region right here, which I kind of highlighted for you guys, it's technically your precentral gyrus. Again, it is sitting right in front of your central sulcus, so it's referred to as the precentral gyrus. It contains specific cells with the goal of creating your motor responses. Again, a skeletal muscle movement only, which means it is voluntary control. Please pay attention. You're going to see this word again. You saw that for the somatosensory, and now you're seeing it for motor. It is motor homunculus, as in, again, you are the more neurons that are going to be sent to a part of the body to control the fine movement of the muscle. The larger part of the brain or motor area needs to be dedicated to controlling those muscles. And the more broad or non-specific the movement of a muscle is, the less area is dedicated in your precentral gyrus to monitor the movement of that muscle. So let me show you on the picture again. Notice again, your hand has a large part of your primary motor cortex dedicated to it because you want to be able to move your fingers very precisely. Think about when you play an instrument, right? Think about if you are a surgeon or a nurse and you're carrying a procedure, right? Think about when you're playing in a guitar, playing your keyboard, right? All of these are very fine motor skills that require extremely careful movement of the muscles. So larger part of your brain is dedicated to controlling the neurons. Again, look at your face. Look at your tongue. Both of these are identified as extremely fine movement. So facial expression, micro expressions of the facial muscles are extremely important for our communication. So again, a lot of neurons are being sent to your face from your brain. So a lot of your precentral gyrus is dedicated to controlling these. Tongue movement in terms of swallowing your food is also extremely important. So a large portion of your motor is controlled or contribute to the movement of the tongue. Now, contralateral again, same concept. If you are controlling the muscles on the left-hand side of the body, they are controlled by the right hemisphere and vice versa. This is, I think, one of the coolest aspects of your brain. It's called premotor cortex, and this is the one that actually gives you muscle memory. So we all do muscle memory on day-to-day basis. Some people may do more. If you type, if you drive, if you play an instrument, if you, for instance, work in an assembly line, then you have to repeat the same job over and over again. These are identified as muscle memory. They help you develop muscle memory. So this is the one that basically helps you plan your movement, creating a coordinated, simultaneous sequential actions. Again, kind of that repetition, right? When you do something repeated over and over and over again, your brain kind of falls into that rhythm for it. So that area is what you see right here. This is called the premotor cortex, which is located right in front of your precentral gyrus. So going back to the PowerPoint here, here is your motor. Right in front of it would be your premotor. So a couple of notes about that. Again, damage to the primary motor cortex, as the one that helps you move your muscles during a stroke, paralyzes the muscles. Does that mean that the muscles are damaged? No, the muscles are intact. You just lost the way to communicate with those muscles. Now, if the damage is to the premotor area, then you lose the ability to create the repetitive motions that are associated with this. So you may be able to, for instance, move your fingers, which is primary motor cortex, but you might not be able to type because you lost the ability to do premotor cortex, or the damage is to the premotor cortex. Now, how can you fix the damage if the person survives a stroke? Repetition, right? So you do occupational therapy, right? You do physical therapy. When you are literally redo the same process over and over and over again to retrain new neurons, not the damaged neurons, new neurons to reprogram within the same region of the brain to do the job of the neurons that died as a result of the stroke. Another area we have, which is kind of a self-explanatory name, is the frontal eye field. So frontal eye field is right in front of the premotor area, and it controls the voluntary eye movement. So the movement of the 6 extrinsic muscles of the eye is controlled by your frontal eye field. The other area you have, which is represented, is this dashed line. It's called the Broca's area. This is present in both the right and left hemisphere, but again, they do a different job. It is usually in left, and I'll explain why that is in just a few minutes. And the motor speech is basically the part that's going to give you the ability to create speech. It is active planning of the speech and voluntary motor activities that are done by your Broca's area. And if this area is damaged, the person may have a difficult time creating the words, basically. Now, this picture that you see is a very general picture that highlights what we have discussed in terms of your various lobes. We have talked about anything that is depicted in red as in different motor areas. We have looked at the areas that are in different shade of blue, which are your sensory or the association areas of that sense. So the only part that we haven't talked about, which as you can see is relatively a large part of your brain, is the multimodal association area depicted in pink. So what are those? They are the ones that are going to receive information from every part of the association area and perform what we identified as higher level analytical functions. So this is basically include reasoning, performing or creating appropriate response to your friends and your environment, be able to think critically, be able to multitask, recall information, create working memory, higher cognitive power, etc. Now it is divided to 3 parts. It is very broad, as it says, so it's not, you don't see that beautiful dash line that you saw for some of the areas that we had previously discussed. But the names for the first 2 are pretty obvious. So you have anterior association area, as in it is located in the front of the brain, versus posterior association area in the back. And then limbic association would be more deep inside the brain. So anterior association area, which is what I showed right here, so it would be typically about this area. It's also called the prefrontal cortex because it's part of the frontal, but it's front of the front, if you want to think about it. It is involved in recall, personality, which is a really big part, memory, creating abstract idea, cognition, judgment, multitasking, reasoning, persistence. So it does a lot of what we are considered as human behavior. Most of this is also developed during a younger age when a person is being exposed to a social environment, and through those social feedbacks, that part of the brain develops. So if somebody has tumors in or lesions on the anterior association area, typically they can cause mental disorders in terms of they may not behave the way that they usually do. Sometimes we can refer to them that their social filter has been removed. So things that we might be inhibited to do because it's not appropriate, they do not see anything wrong with them completing in an environment. So those social restraints that basically considered to be norm may not make sense to these individuals, and they may act irrationally, take risks, again, be more obnoxious because those filters have been removed as they are associated with the prefrontal cortex. One thing that I also want to point out, a lot of people find it difficult as they age to assimilate into a new culture. So if you move from one country to another, if you're older, it's harder to accept the new culture. And the main reason is that because the prefrontal cortex, which basically develops personal behavior, is more fully grown and developed, versus if you are, let's say, a child or a teenager moving to a new culture, it's much easier for you to assimilate because you already have some connections from your previous culture, and you can form new connections to assimilate into the new culture. But again, as you age, as you get older, it becomes harder and harder to form those new connections that develops the personal behavior based on the social feedback. Limbic association area, I'm not going to go into detail about this, but I do want you guys to understand it provides what we identified as an emotional impact that can allow you to create memories from things that are important to you. Now that memory can be something good, something negative, something happy, stressful, it doesn't really matter as far as it is some sort of memory that your brain is creating based on the environment that is placed there. And the last one that I want to talk to you, and I will finish up this PowerPoint, is what we identify as posterior association area, which is this kind of area. This is associated with 3 of your lobes, the parietal lobe, occipital, and temporal lobe. Oh, sorry, guys. And this is really, really important in terms of, giving you the ability to recognize patterns, faces, objects that are around you. They also give you the ability to understand the spoken language or the written words. That area specifically for the understanding of the written and the spoken language is an area called the Wernicke's area, which is again shown with dashed line. And what happens if somebody has lesions or problems with their posterior association area? One of the main things that they see is they are not very aware of their self, the parts of their bodies within a space around them. For instance, a person may refuse to wash part of their body or part of, let's say, one of the appendixes because they belong that part of the body does not belong to them. They believe that part doesn't belong to them. So that's a problem with a posterior association area. Okay, so we are going to stop here and we'll pick up the rest of the PowerPoint for the central nervous system on part 3.